1,000-foot view, here it is. So our presentation is how to get started with feature updates, and this is like absolutely amazing for us to put this together because just about like 2 weeks ago, I was asking all these questions like, what is servicing? How can I use it? And all the information is out there, but they're in so many different places, and it takes such a long time to research it. And I, for one, am grateful to be presenting and also grateful to be here to listen to the other parts of the presentation because I'm going to be doing servicing in my environment very soon. So without further ado, my name is Chad Brower. I'm a sysadmin at some insurance company. And Mike Marble is my partner in crime.
That's me. Sorry. Mike Marble, I work for Michigan Medicine, formerly the University of Michigan Health System.
So I've been doing this 10 years-ish, starting with OSD. I was listening to Johan 10 years ago, how to do MDT, all that stuff, and I've come a long way in the configuration manager area. Mike, 20 years, right? Breaking things.
Yeah. Old guy here.
Yeah. So this slide's like supposed to be a little quick bio. I don't have a lot of hobbies. I have kids, so I kind of give up all those hobbies. I'm sure people know what that's like. So why make the transition? Julie kind of hit off a couple of these prior to this presentation, but one of the big things is this process can work off the VPN, and you don't necessarily need to have any of the customization. You could just set it, forget it type of things. But as long as you have a machine that's reachable to the internet, you don't really need to go through the VPN or cloud management gateway. It just kind of depends on how you configure in your environment. And as mentioned, there's less end-user downtime. One of the biggest advantages of doing feature updates through Configuration Manager is the user is allowed to use the machine, and as long as you stage the content well ahead of time, they're doing their work, and then they'll reboot when they need to. And the next thing is there's less complexity for you. Well, at least there can be. It's really up to you how complex you want to make it. If you have a really robust task sequence like Mike Marble does, there's probably a lot of moving parts and pieces that you're going to program into some of the custom actions that Mike is going to talk about later in the presentation. And you can keep your existing process. You don't have to reinvent the wheel per se. If you have a really, like I said, robust task sequence, you could just take those bits and pieces and plug it into where it needs to go into in your custom actions while you're doing your feature update. So how do you get there? So you could do Microsoft Update, just let it ride, right? Let people get the feature updates. You can use an ISO. It's a very, very manual way, but it's possible to use ISO for this process. You can use WSIS with group policy, which is something that my organization was doing up until earlier this year. And you can not approve your feature updates until you're ready for those in your environment, or with WSIS, you can create computer groups and such and approve for certain computer groups. So it's possible to use WSIS with group policy. And then you can use Intune, a simple way to manage your Azure Active Directory devices, co-managed devices, and still using the built-in OS experience with Intune. Set it and forget it type of thing. And then finally, Configuration Manager, which I'm sure a lot of people are using to do it. You could use task sequences or servicing. And in this presentation, we're talking about servicing. So we're going to kind of talk about some of the prerequisites for Configuration Manager, just to get off the ground, get this working. So number one, you're going to have software updates enabled. So software updates is basically the way you deploy Windows updates through your environment with WSIS attached to your Configuration Manager. And then WSIS, you're going to have these two categories checked, upgrades and updates. Upgrades that's where you're going to get your feature updates from, and then upgrades are going to be where you get your regular Windows community updates and your dynamic updates. Some of the WSIS products that you're going to want to check and maybe not check is, of course, Windows 10, Windows 10 1903 and later, and I asked myself this question while I was doing this presentation: do you really need to check servicing drivers with Windows 1903 and later? Well, the answer is no, because they don't do anything. I checked, and inside my configuration manager, I don't see any updates with the product category servicing drivers. And the same goes for upgrades and servicing drivers. I don't see any updates in those. So you probably don't need to check those boxes. Maybe someone can clarify that for me, but I didn't see any updates in those categories. And finally, one of the things you're going to want to take a look at is dynamic updates. And another way to call dynamic updates is GDR-DU, which stands for General Distribution Release DUs, dynamic updates. And some of these categories are kind of confusing, and really there's no like page on Microsoft you can go to and go see what these mean and figure out which ones you want to check, which ones you don't want to check. And so I did a ton of research trying to figure those out for everyone and for myself, because I'm just starting this off. And so basically, for dynamic updates, just in general, you just need to have that box checked, dynamic updates. And so that's going to provide pretty much dynamic updates for every version of Windows 10. And the same token, you could also check GDR-DU, which would provide a similar experience for you. And to kind of illustrate that a little bit, so here's the dynamic update for Windows 1909, 64-bit based, and your affected product. So this one comes from that category, Windows 10 dynamic update. Well, at the same time, this is what gets kind of confusing for me. You also have a dynamic update that comes from the GDR-DU. So really, I need to do some more research on this and what the difference is. It seems like they're the same, but for in general, you're going to want dynamic updates enabled. And with dynamic updates, you get like optimizations for the installation of the operating system or setup before it goes through, and you get your community updates, and you get to keep your language packs, your features on demand. That's what dynamic updates do for you. Oh, all right. Next slide. So we're talking about Configuration Manager, and I just want to talk about some of the client settings that work just out of the box in the Configuration Manager. So you don't necessarily have to have custom actions, custom scripts to do any of this stuff. Some of the things are just built right into the Configuration Manager client settings. And so two of the things that you can do are feature update priority. And what this means is you can set how much resources you want your operating system to consume while you're doing your feature update. So you can set it to low, or you can set it to normal, or you can not configure it. And so what normal is obviously it will allow you to use more processor time, and it will shorten the total time of your deployment with feature update. And low obviously means that you'll do it in the background, and it'll have less processing time and all that. That's something that you can configure within Configuration Manager. The other thing you can configure is your dynamic updates. Now, I should mention that these are turned on by default when you do servicing, but if you don't want them to go through, you have the ability to control whether they're on or not. And I want to mention that with dynamic updates, if you're not on version 1809, so if you're on 1803 or later, you have a kind of a caveat when it comes to dynamic updates. And that's because 1803 and later, they look at your WSDA server for the content and the location for your dynamic updates. And so that can present kind of a problem for someone that's not talking to your WSDA server. And so I kind of experienced this a couple weeks ago. I had an 1803 laptop that wasn't talking to the VPN, and it kept bombing the install, and I was trying to figure out why. Well, I went through the Windows logs, and it saying it couldn't find this dynamic update. And lo and behold, I was like, well, I didn't even know I was on 1803, and I didn't even know this was a caveat. But one thing I want to say about that is Adam Gross has a couple of blog posts on this, because I know he's experienced this, and you can actually trick the operating system to go to Microsoft Update to go get your dynamic updates if you're attached to a WSDA server. And then the next thing is 1809 and later just goes directly to MS Update for their update content, which is really nice. All right, Mike, you want to take over?
Sure. 1 second here. Share this out. Hopefully it'll pop up here in one moment. Oh, this is going to make a fool out of me right out of the bed, right out of the gate, isn't it?
I can see it.
Has it popped up?
Yeah.
Yep. We got you.
Okay. All right, good. All right. So, kind of with the driving point of what we're all here for. A lot of us, I'm sure, have been using task sequences to do your in-place upgrades. It's kind of been the traditional way over the last several years. Particularly if you go to MMS, there was always a big driving theme. Don't do servicing, do task sequences. Well, now we're all here this morning to talk about, you know what? Give servicing a second look and give it a shot. So, I personally, from Michigan Medicine, for the last couple of years, that's exactly what we've been doing. I've been beating the drum. In-place upgrade task sequence. It's what we got to use, and particularly with all the lockdown and work from home and everything with the pandemic here, it's kind of pushed us to reevaluate that, because one of the problems we had is our task sequence doesn't run over a VPN connection. So we had to essentially move from task sequences to servicing. So what's the process of doing that? Well, first you need to figure out exactly why are you using the task sequence. What is it that you're accomplishing? What are you trying to do with your task sequence? Are you updating drivers? Do you have applications you have to reinstall? And the big thing for us was like the corporate branding. So you kind of want to take a look at, because what we're going to be doing. Slow down here a second, Mike. What we're going to be doing is porting these things over to what Microsoft refers to as custom actions. So the first step, there's primarily two components with the feature updates. The first being the setup config INI file. What this does is it provides all the command line parameters for setup. And regardless of how you run setup, whether it's a feature update, whether it's being installed from an ISO, it's the user dropping in a DVD, these components are built in natively to setup. So if you have like your setup config INI, if you have it in the default location here, if you get in this spot, regardless of how the machine is upgraded, it's going to be looking for that file, and your settings are all going to be in place here. Couple I want to point out here, like Chad was talking about in the client settings and config manager, with the priority, you can specify that in your setup. Let's say you're not using config man, you can specify the priority of how the upgrade should be processed behind the scenes. Dynamic updates, again, you can enable it through the setup config, so it's passed as a command line parameter to setup. Post UBI. This you can specify a script, a batch file that you want to have executed at the end of the out-of-box experience when the update is completed and successfully. Now, yes, it's a batch file, but that's just the kickoff point. This batch file can call PowerShell scripts, it can call executables, it can call VB scripts, it can call JavaScripts. It's looking to fire off a batch file that you could then have spawn off anything else you need. And the last one I want to point out here real quick on it is the install drivers. This is your plug and play drivers. So let's say you're providing a new set of drivers for, you're upgrading from 1809 to 1909. And maybe you're an HP shop and HP's got a specific set of drivers for that build. You could drop them into this a folder. You can specify wherever you want it. And with this parameter, it'll instruct setup to look to that folder for all the plug and play. Okay, custom actions. This is the second component I want to talk about. This is the meat and potatoes. This is where all the work's going to be done. There's what the pre-install runs before the setup kicks off. So if there's things you need to do ahead of time before you begin the update, this would be the phase you would run it in. And I'll have some examples here in a moment. Pre-commit happens just immediately prior to a reboot being required. And then the setup complete is called by the post UBI. That's where all your reinstalls essentially are going to happen. So like I said, most of us have been using IPU task sequences. Everyone's is going to be different, but roughly it's going to follow this sort of model. This is the default out of the box from Microsoft. All these portions here, excuse me, in the prepare for upgrade section, that would all drop into your pre-install. Like in our case, we have a registry key where we've populated with all sorts of configuration and inventory information about the workstation. What department does the computer belong to? What building? What room? That sort of thing. Well, this dates back to pre-XP days, and at that time, it was decided to drop it into system key. Well, the update wipes out that system key, so what we had to do in our task sequence is we'd have a PowerShell script that would back up that key and then restore it later. With the feature install, the with the feature update with the pre-install script, it calls that same PowerShell script out of that we have in our task sequence, backs up the registry key for us. If you have applications that are hard blockers to the upgrade, you can put the run installs in here. Same thing if you have drivers that are going to be a hard blocker. You can remove them in the pre-install from the pre-install custom action, because that'll be executed before the actual upgrade begins. Now this pre-commit, this is something you have that you can't tap into with the task sequence. But the task sequence, once the upgrade reaches that reboot, it's rebooting the machine. With the pre-commit, it's another batch file that setup natively looks for and runs. In our case, we have a homebrewed user notification utility. So we've suppressed all the native config-man reboot dialogues and notifications. And out of the pre-commit script, we just call this executable, and it'll display the message to the user, your machine needs to reboot. Do you want to reboot now? Do you want to defer it? How many deferrals they have? That sort of thing. And then lastly, the setup complete. This is where all the hard work's going to happen. If you are reinstalling applications, it'll be done out of here. If you have, let's say, updated helper apps, touchpad controls, hotkeys, things like that need to be reinstalled, it would happen out of here. So how does this actually all come together? Well, the key, like Chad had mentioned, that this works without a VPN connection. So for that to happen, everything has to be located and cached on the workstation or the laptop before this upgrade starts. To do that, you have a couple of ways of doing it. You can, and like everything else with Config Manager, you have options. You can do configuration items. I'm sorry, compliance items, configuration baselines to put the content on the machines at a time. You could just script it. You can bundle it all up in a package or an application. But most often, a lot of people will use a pre-staging sequence. So if they've invested time in creating an overall WAS process, and let's say they're running a compat scan sequence, they'll add on to that. They can take their existing compat scan sequence, add in essentially actions that do a little more than copy files. Copy them all to their respective folders on the local machine, and when the feature updates processed later on, all the content's local, doesn't need a connection back to the data center. Excuse me. And with that, jump to the end here. Hopefully we came in on time.
You guys did perfect. All right, so we've had some discussion going on in the chat over here as you guys are going. So one of the questions was, do you recommend using the high setting in the setup config ini file? And I said only do that in testing, and really you should you should use low if you at least respect your users a little bit. But normal seems to be okay if you've got decent hardware in your environment, and that really only impacts the background processing time of the whenever it's the offline. Is it offline time? The online time. So,
yeah, the down level.
Yeah, before it does the first reboot in the background there. So certainly don't do that unless you want to consume your user's whole computer. And high is not technically even supported. It's not listed as a supported option either. So, and the other thing I mentioned in the chat was that so Chad was showing how to do the setup config INI using the when you set those client settings policies for normal and dynamic updates. Those write your setup config INI file. If you do what Mike was showing, where you do a custom one, they will conflict with each other if you use both. So the config manager policy will continually overwrite anything custom that you put there. So pick one, don't do both.
Right.
Any other questions? If you want to come off mute and ask, or if you type it in the chat, we'll certainly throw it out here real quick before we move on to the next topic. You guys did fantastic. This is awesome. Good start.
Thanks, Adam.
One question.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Currently, we are using in-place task sequence model, and we are going to VAS process model, and we are supporting more than 2 lakhs clients. The big problem is we are using the general ENUS language pack. On the top of it, maybe the local language used. Let's say Chinese, they are using Chinese language, and other location they are using respective languages. So if I try to create a ring, or I need to try to deploy different language, means it's a more burden, right? It's very easy to install in place because we can inject lot of language pack and use single task sequence and deploy it. So how we can mitigate this kind of problem? If I deploy ENUS on top of EN Chinese or some other Chinese language, definitely this Chinese language will be removed after upgrade, maybe 2004. So how to avoid or how to install this kind of issue? And the second question, also it removing the FOD packages. So this is my 2 questions. Why it's removing the other language pack, and also why it's not able to install the same language packs. This is kind of a big gap.
Well, I have to admit I've had no practical experience with language packs, but in theory, how you're handling it in your task sequence, that same logic should be able to be applied using the custom action. If it needs to be a reinstall of the language pack, you can have that added into the setup complete script, and then whatever checks are being done, determine whether that language pack needs to be installed or not on that particular device. That same check would still apply, and then do the installation of the language pack in theory.
Yeah. Yeah, Mike, that's a little bit different with language packs. So language packs are part of the operating system. And when you look at your feature updates in your Windows servicing, you'll see there is a feature update for each language. So you need to match that feature update with that the language that is the setup language. So if that can vary depending on how you are leveraging getting those machines built with a particular language. But it is important to match those up. And if you want to keep multiple languages on the machine, say for instance, your machines are in different languages, but you want to go ahead and keep English as a alternative on all of those machines, you can then put that cab file for the English language pack in your on your machines ahead of time and point your setup config.ini file to it. So that way it'll consume that during the upgrade and do that. In fact, a lot of my customers that are juggling multiple languages move to feature updates faster because it's so much easier than trying to do the in-place upgrade and having all those WIMs together. And I'm sure, I know Marius can talk a little bit further about that. He deals with lots of languages as well. Yeah, it's important to match them up.
Marius, and also, I think there was an issue, and I think it maybe got fixed in 2004, where there's like a known issue with this, where the language packs were getting removed. And I think Dune should be on later, and we can, I'll make a note, and we can ask him about that as well, because I believe this was actually, it's supposed to, the desired effect was it should have handled your language packs and things, but it doesn't because of a bug or something, and that they have resolved in later OS releases. But I'll have to confirm that with. Hey, Dune. Yeah.
Hey. I mean, we know that we for sure know that language packs are not persisted across feature updates if you're using WSUS. It's actually not true when we talk to the cloud side of this. For customers who are using Windows Update for Business, they shouldn't have this problem. But there's my cat, right on schedule. But for WSUS feature update customers, right now, you do need to do this pre-staging bit. If you are doing the pre-staging bit and not seeing your language packs working correctly, then that could be a bug. But that action is still necessary today. Stay tuned for my little short section at the end for what we're trying to do to address that.
Yeah, so just to clarify, you just got to get those language packs on before the feature update starts and point to that location with your setup config.ini file. But no, go ahead, Marius. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Well, one easy way around this is actually if you do have the Windows Store open, it to be able to pull updates, you can make use of these LXP language packs and install them, and they are being kind of preserved during the in-place upgrades. And once it figures out it is on a new version of Windows, it will download the update for the LXPs from the store. If these LXPs suffice for you, yeah. Different story and feature on demand though.
Thank you for your answer. If I get some documents, it could be really good. Anyway, thanks for all.
Yeah, this is one of those things that's just not heavily documented. And one of the reasons we're doing this particular segment. The important thing to remember with a feature update is any switch you can use in Windows Setup, you can use in your setup config.ini file. And so that's the secret sauce to making feature updates work, is to leverage that. All right, we've got a little bit more time here. Do we want to talk more about the dynamic updates? That's usually I know we've had quite a bit going on in the chat, and that's a huge issue. And it did change the way dynamic updates worked from 1803 going forward. Now, dynamic updates come directly from the internet for 1803 forward. So even though you can see them in WSUS, there's not a mechanism to pull that in. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Dune, but that's what my customers are seeing, that does come directly from the internet, and that does pose problems in low bandwidth situations, but it's not as bad as a lot of people make it out to be. It's only going to, generally I see it pulling the latest cumulative update, the latest servicing stack. Rarely do I see it pulling some drivers, but those are typically what I see coming down. The official things, I'll post this in the chat from our docs. I know this is a little bit long, but this lists all the different things that can be part of dynamic updates. No, and dynamic updates does not use connected cache at this point.
Yep. And I would just, I've been promoting DUs in the chat here as we're going. But Yeah, I've written extensively about DUs and our challenges with it over the last couple of years, and doing it with in-place upgrades and task sequences, trying to go from 7 to 10, and the challenges there, and then doing it with feature updates. And I understand there are bandwidth challenges and things around this, but the success rate that you will see with them versus without them is significant. But you do get so it'll download a setup update, which is like it's equivalent to getting the servicing stack update, and that comes with a new appraiser database that runs a new compat appraiser to find like the latest compat blocks that make block setup, and then it will get the latest cumulative update as well, because especially if you're coming from config manager, if you're delivering using config manager and WSUS, then the ESD file, the compressed ISO that's being used for this, is old. It's the original release. It's not patched. So if there was a way with things like UUP or something to not have to get dynamic updates, then you would reduce that payload. But currently, you have to incur that payload as well. So you're bringing down 500 megs to 700 meg latest cumulative update for each client. Plus, sometimes you have drivers that get downloaded as well. They're compatibility related drivers to ensure that things like your network and hard drives and things like that stay on that are critical to the setup process. So, we've been doing it for several releases now, and most of it's been on-prem, but this last round we did it all over VPN with split tunneling, and it just works. And blame your security guys if your networking guys yell at you about not being able to get this stuff. And there's a ton of stuff coming in the chat, so if you don't have the chat popped open, definitely go through it, and then obviously save these links off if you need this info. Anyone else have anything else to add about dynamic updates?
Could we talk about really quickly how the documentation says that it will preserve language packs and features on demand, but it seems like there's conflicting information about whether that actually works?
It will work if you have dynamic updates enabled and if it can get through your proxy. However, so you're going to see some different. So language packs, when you have if you're building such that you have like 12 languages in your image when you build, and then it's selected through the build process to become German, for example, then as that machine is used, those language packs that are not being used will fall off automatically. Windows will uninstall those. And the reason for that is the more language packs you have on a machine, the longer the servicing takes, the longer Windows updates, your monthly patches take, and the longer the upgrade process will take. So you should be able to, you can use the DISM online commands to see what languages are actually present, and you can apply the content ahead of time, or you can let dynamic updates pull it. And if you watch during that first phase, that down level phase, there's a folder created called DU Sandbox, and you'll actually see what's being downloaded. And in my session, I'll show you where you can find it in the setup ACT log, what's actually getting downloaded. So it will work, but the biggest trouble that I see is customers enabling dynamic updates because that is coming directly from the internet. And it doesn't leverage any of your content distribution systems.
What was the caveat for using dynamic updates on 1803?
I'm sorry, it broke up a little bit. Say that again.
What was the caveat about using 1803 dynamic updates?
I just posted in the chat a link to a blog post that Neiman Marcus made. Kind of explains exactly what's going on behind the scenes.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, we are right on time to I'm going to stop this recording and start another.